Hello everyone, welcome back to the classes from Anatomy Weekly. Today, in this episode, we'll be discussing about the general anatomy of bone.
We all are familiar with the bone, and we know that bone is a tissue which forms the framework and provides mechanical support. What type of tissue is it? It is a connective tissue. What is a connective tissue? Well, we will be talking about the connective tissue in our respective classes, but for now, you can have an idea by looking at these foam cushions meant for packing fragile materials. If these fragile utensils are the functioning cells, then you can imagine the packing material as the connective tissue.
Welcome to Anatomy Weekly.
The connective tissue are like every other tissue, having cells, some fibers, and a base on which all these things lie, that is the ground substance. Now, if the bone is a connective tissue, why is it categorized as a special one?
Here is the answer. Unlike other connective tissue, its extracellular component, that is, the fibers and the ground substance, are mineralized, and that means it has plenty of minerals like calcium and phosphorus, which gives it enough strength to form our framework and support our body. Well, now we know that the bone is a specialized connective tissue. Let us move on to see a bone with its blood supply. As you can see a long bone over here, look at the number of vessels entering it and forming a rich vascular plexus. Therefore, a bone is a special connective tissue which is highly vascular. Another property of bone is that depending on the demands placed, that is the pressure and the traction, bones have an inbuilt ability to remodel. In astronauts, bone-forming cells, that is the osteoblasts, tends to lose their function without the effect of gravity.
Now as we move on, let us get familiar with some terms. Skeletal system consists of an exoskeleton or an endoskeleton. For most of the animals, including us, it is the endoskeleton which is formed by the bones and cartilages, and both forms of skeletons are concerned with protection. Osteon refers to bone in Greek. Osteology is the branch of anatomy which deals with the study of bones.
Now let us discuss the functions of the bone. Bone provides the framework for the structure, it gives the mechanical support, it gives the leverage for the movements by giving attachment to the tendons and the ligaments, protecting the vital organs, erythropoiesis which happens in the bone marrow, storage of minerals like calcium and phosphorus, part of the reticuloendothelial system within the vascular bone marrow cavity for defense mechanism, assists in respiration and stores energy as fat.
Now let us come to the classification of bones. The first is the classification according to the development. There are two types here, membranous and enchondral or cartilaginous ossification. The second is the classification of bones according to size and shape. The third is the structural classification, and the fourth is the regional classification.
Now let's see the classification according to the development. While talking about the membranous ossification happens in the flat bones of the cranial vault. In this process, the mesenchymal stem cells forms sheets of membranes in the area for future bone formation. Near an area of the sheet, some of these mesenchymal cells transform into a cell known as osteoblasts. These osteoblasts then lay down the collagen fibers and the ground substance. Once the ground substance is mineralized by minerals like calcium and phosphorus, these osteoblasts are trapped within, and now we call them as osteocytes. This process goes on throughout the membrane to form the bones.
Cartilaginous or enchondral ossification is typically seen in all the long bones of the body except in the lateral half of the clavicle. During enchondral ossification, the mesenchymal cells lay down a framework of hyaline cartilage on the sides which are destined to form the long bones. This cartilaginous framework is covered by the perichondrium, which is the outer covering of a cartilage. Since there are no blood vessels now, the chondrocytes receive the nutrition through diffusion from the perichondrium. Soon, the nutrient artery enters the center of the bone through the periosteal bud and brings along with itself the bone-forming osteoblasts. These osteoblasts lay down bony tissue by the side of the shaft. This is called the bone collar. The bone collar inhibits the diffusion of the nutrient material, leading to apoptosis or death of the chondrocytes, which lead to formation of some spaces within. Now the nutrient artery moves further through these spaces and brings more osteoblasts, thus replacing the cartilaginous model with bone tissue. This whole process happens before birth. After birth, the secondary ossification center appears near the ends, and the arteries entering this part lays down the bony tissue in a similar manner. While this process is the secondary ossification, the previous one, which happened before birth, is the primary ossification. So we just saw that the central part of the bone is formed by primary ossification. This part of the bone is called the diaphysis. Similarly, we also saw that the ends of the bone is formed by secondary ossification. These parts are called the epiphysis.
Now, according to the size and shape, the bone can be classified as the long bones, the short long bones, short bones, flat bones, irregular bones, pneumatic bones, and the sesamoid bones. Now, according to the structural classification, if we see a long bone with the medullary cavity inside, the part which lies in the middle consists of the bony tissue which is tightly packed. It makes up 80% of the skeletal tissue mass with a high bone content and less porosity. It contributes prominently to the mechanical strength. This part present within the middle of the bone, that is the shaft, surrounding the medullary cavity is called the cortical bone or the compact bone. Moving towards the end, this area has bony tissue with spaces inside them. The wall of these spaces are made up of thin plates of bones called the trabeculae. The whole arrangement over here appears like a sponge and is therefore called the spongy or the cancellous or the trabecular bone. The third variety, that is the diploic bone, consists of an outer and an inner table of compact bone with spongy bone in between. These spaces within the spongy bone consist of bone marrow and some veins. Most of the cranial bones are diploic bones.
Moving on to the regional classification of bones, we have the axial bones. The bones which occupy the axis or the central part of the human skeleton are called the axial bones, like the skull, the ribs, and the vertebrae. Appendicular bones, the bones which are attached to these axial bones as appendages or attachments, are called the appendicular bones. These are mainly the bones of upper and the lower limb.
Let us discuss the structure of a long bone. If you see a long bone, inside it there is a cavity called the medullary cavity. This middle part of the bone with the medullary cavity inside is commonly called as the shaft. This part of the bone lies between the two ends of the bone, so called the diaphysis. Dia means in between. Diaphysis is surrounded all around by the compact bone or the cortical bone. The medullary cavity does not extend till the end. The area at the ends where there is no medullary cavity is known as epiphysis. As discussed earlier, the epiphysis is having some spaces inside them which are lined by bony trabeculae, giving it an appearance of a sponge, and the bone which lies over here is known as the spongy bone.
Even in the shaft, there are areas towards the ends where the marrow cavity does not extend, and we can see spaces which are very similar to what we saw in the epiphysis. This part, which can also be termed as the epiphyseal end of the diaphysis, is called the metaphysis. After ossification, the metaphysis acts as an area for load bearing from epiphysis to the diaphysis. In between metaphysis and epiphysis, in young individuals, there lies a plate of cartilage. This is an area of active bone growth. Being more pliable, the cartilage here provides flexibility to the bones, and the cartilage itself acts as a joint. This is called the epiphyseal plate of cartilage. However, in adults, soon this plate is replaced by bone, and then it is called the epiphyseal line. Even though the diaphysis consists of the cortical bone, a very thin inner lining of spongy bone is present here. Similarly, for epiphysis, a very thin lining of cortical bone is present over the spongy bone. Peri means outer, ostium means bone. Therefore, the outer covering of the bone is called the periosteum. It consists of an outer fibrous and an inner cellular layer. The cellular layer gives rise to new bone whenever needed. In the area where the epiphyses articulate to form joints with the adjacent bones, the periosteum is absent. These areas are replaced by a cartilage for smooth articular movement. This is called the articular cartilage. Just like the periosteum, which forms the outer covering of the bone, there is an inner lining in the medullary cavity. This is known as the endosteum.
Moving towards the blood supply of a long bone, we already know by now that the bone is a very vascular tissue. Now, this happens because of the numerous arteries which supply almost all the parts of a long bone. And since we are discussing the general anatomy, we will stick to the long bones only. The nutrient artery. If we look at this picture of the long bone, we can see an artery which enters the very center of a long bone at the shaft. This was the primary artery which brought the very first cells to the cartilaginous framework that formed the bone during the enchondral ossification. Therefore, this is called the nutrient artery or sometimes the diaphyseal artery. It divides into two branches after entering the medullary cavity and moves towards both the metaphysis. It is a single and tortuous artery and accompanied by two veins. It enters the shaft through the nutrient foramen. The tortuosity helps it in tackling movements. The metaphyseal artery are derived from arteries around the joints. They pass through small openings around the metaphysis to supply the metaphysis and epiphysis. The epiphyseal artery are derived from arteries around the joints again. These are only present if the joint capsule ends in the epiphysis. And lastly, the periosteal arteries. The periosteal arteries remains all throughout the area where the periosteum is present. All these arteries communicate in the metaphysis. Thus, metaphysis is a very vascular area.
One important dictum over here, which the nutrient artery says, is that towards the elbow I go, away from the knee I flee, which means that the nutrient artery runs obliquely, and while doing so, it goes towards the elbow joint and away from the knee joint. Now, opposite to the direction of the nutrient artery is the growing end of the bone. Let us try to understand it better. While the bone develops, the nutrient artery occupies a central position, as one end of the bone continues to grow for long. In comparison to the other part, it will push the artery to the opposite side, that is, to the side where the growth is comparatively slow. Therefore, the artery is pushed by the growing end to the opposite side. Now, if we go through the dictum again, towards the elbow I go, away from the knee I flee, the growing ends are opposite to it, that is, away from the elbow and towards the knee.
As we know what is an epiphysis by now, let us have a look at the different types of epiphysis. The epiphysis which are produced due to weight bearing or gravitational pull are called the pressure epiphysis. Example, the femoral condyles. When the pull or traction of a muscle produces an epiphysis, it's called a traction epiphysis. Example, the greater trochanter of femur. There are some bones like the coracoid process of scapula, which is otherwise a separate bone in lower animals, but in humans it gets attached to the nearby bone. This type of epiphysis is called the atavistic epiphysis. Sometimes an epiphysis may be present at an area which is not a normal site for it, like in this picture where it is present in the lower end of second metacarpal. This type of epiphysis is called an aberrant epiphysis.
Finally, let us learn about the laws of ossification. The laws of ossification are as follows. Number 1, the primary center of ossification appears before birth, except for the carpal bones. Number 2, the secondary center appears after birth, except for the lower end of femur and the upper end of tibia. Number 3, at the end of some bones, there can be more than one secondary centers, and the bones ossifying from secondary centers fuses with each other first and then fuses with the shaft, except for the upper end of femur. Number 4, the secondary center which appears first fuses last. Number 5, the end which fuses last is the growing end. And number 6, the direction of the nutrient artery is away from the growing end. We will be discussing the different types of ossification in details in our next class. Thank you for listening.